Some mysteries gleam not with gold, but with the illusions that men weave around it. It begins with a curious map found among a dead sailor's papers, a chart that promises fortune, but conceals betrayal, envy, and murder. Where are you tuning in from, and what time is it? Let me know in the comments. The truth waits behind a veil of smoke and silence. Let us draw it aside and follow Holmes into the heart of the deception. It was upon a damp and restless morning in London that I first became acquainted with the curious affair of the hidden map. The fog hung low and heavy, pressing against the windows of Baker Street as if the city itself wished to intrude upon our quiet. A steady drizzle tapped the panes with monotonous persistence, and the air carried that peculiar chill which seems to sink not merely into one's coat, but into the very bones. Holmes sat by the fire in an unusually contemplative mood, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin, and his gaze fixed not upon any visible object, but rather upon some inward calculation. I had grown accustomed to such silences, broken only by the occasional mutter or quick glance, and I confess I took comfort in them, for they presaged activity of a stimulating kind. The street below, muffled by fog, gave little sound of life, and I had resigned myself to a day of my friend's abstraction when a sharp knock echoed from the door below, decisive yet hesitant, as though the knocker himself was uncertain whether to persist. Mrs. Hudson's tread announced the approach of a visitor, and Holmes's eyes, until then absorbed, flickered with the gleam of one scenting the approach of a problem worthy of his faculties. The gentleman who entered was of middle age, with features precise to the point of severity, yet softened by an unmistakable air of anxiety. His dress was that of a professional man, neat, subdued, and entirely proper, yet his gloved hands fidgeted as though they betrayed a mind ill at ease. He introduced himself as Mr. Archibald Kent, solicitor of Lincoln's Inn, and I observed in him that peculiar mixture of composure and agitation which belongs to men accustomed to self-command, but presently pressed by circumstance beyond their usual control. His voice was steady enough, yet it carried a timbre of urgency as he begged a private consultation with Mr. Sherlock Holmes. At Holmes's courteous gesture, he took the chair opposite, his lips moving as though he rehearsed inwardly the manner in which he should disclose his errand. I could see that the visit cost him no little effort, and I wondered what affair of law or legacy had so disturbed his habitual balance. "My business, Mr. Holmes," said Kent after a pause, "is one I might have hesitated to bring before you, were it not for its singularity. Among the effects of my late client, Captain Horace Bracknell, there was found an object which, while trifling in appearance, has already unsettled the family, and may, I fear, occasion discord. It is a hand-drawn map, enclosed in a sealed envelope, discovered in a desk that bore otherwise nothing of value. The map, at first glance, appears nautical in nature, though to what purpose it was intended I cannot say. Its presence has provoked speculation among the heirs, and I confess myself unable to determine whether it is of any worth or merely a fanciful relic of the captain's long naval service." As he spoke, he drew from his case the envelope in question, which bore the yellowing of years and the faint scent of sealing wax. With deliberate care, he laid it upon Holmes's desk, his eyes fixed upon my companion with a mixture of relief and apprehension. Holmes, who had listened in his habitual silence, now reached for the envelope and withdrew its contents. Spreading the paper upon the table, he bent over it with the absorbed attention of one to whom trifles speak volumes. The map was roughly drawn, yet certain lines betrayed a practiced hand. I watched as his keen eyes travelled along the inked strokes, his lips pursed in quiet concentration. He ran a slender finger across one portion, then drew back as though the paper itself had whispered to him. "Curious," he murmured. "Most curious indeed. The hand betrays two different habits of writing, one careful, measured, and possessed of genuine knowledge, the other less disciplined, almost careless in execution. Note, Watson, the variance in ink here and here, not merely fading, but of different composition. He spoke no more, but the flicker in his gaze told me that the matter had already suggested to him possibilities which he chose not yet to disclose. He folded the paper with studied indifference and returned it to its envelope. Mr. Kent, leaning forward, betrayed his inner turmoil with a hurried exclamation. "You see, Mr. Holmes, the late captain's affairs were not without complication. His niece, Miss Clara Bracknell, is by his will the principal beneficiary. Yet there exist distant relations who may seize upon this discovery to assert claims, should the map point to some hidden wealth. I fear not only for the harmony of the family, but for Miss Bracknell herself, whose situation is already precarious. She is young, unprotected, and subject to pressures which, in unscrupulous hands, might prove overwhelming." He paused, his eyes betraying an unspoken anxiety. Holmes, with that quiet manner which could pierce to the core of a matter, inquired whether the captain's life had given occasion for suspicion, or whether his habits or voyages might suggest the existence of treasure or secret trust. Kent hesitated, then admitted that whispers of quarrels and unrecorded journeys had circulated among former shipmates, though nothing was ever substantiated. The solicitor's manner betrayed both his professional caution and his personal sympathy for the young lady now entangled in this uncertainty. Holmes replaced the envelope upon the table and leaned back in his chair, the faint smile upon his lips that betokened interest rather than amusement. "You ask me, Mr. Kent, whether I will investigate this relic. My answer must be in the affirmative, yet with a caveat. You must prepare yourself, and Miss Bracknell likewise, for the possibility that truth may prove less gratifying than conjecture. Gold, sir, is oft more alluring in the imagination than in the counting-house. Illusions, once shattered, are apt to leave sharper fragments than any reality." Kent bowed his head in acknowledgement, though I observed a shadow of unease upon his countenance. Relief mingled with doubt as he rose to take his leave, and as the door closed behind him, I saw that Holmes's eyes had regained their characteristic brightness. It was clear to me that the map, though in outward aspect but a scrap of paper, had already engaged that subtle faculty which made of my friend the foremost detective in Europe. For myself, I felt the first stirrings of curiosity and apprehension which were to deepen in the days to come. Holmes drew the blinds a fraction lower, allowing the lamplight to fall in a narrow circle upon the desk. With careful fingers he spread the aged paper before us, smoothing its creases until the lines stood forth in wavering clarity. The map, though no larger than a foolscap sheet, bore the aspect of long concealment, the edges frayed, the ink browned to a rust-like hue, and faint stains mottled across its surface like shadows of forgotten years. My eyes, though untrained, were immediately caught by the strange mixture of precision and crudity which it displayed. Here a compass rose was drawn with admirable symmetry, there a coastline sketched with childish irregularity. Symbols, half decipherable, crowded the margins. Tiny anchors, dotted lines, cryptic figures. Under the glow of the lamp, the whole assumed an air of mystery at once alluring and disquieting. It seemed to whisper of distant seas and perilous ventures, of secrets carried home from voyages beyond our ken. I glanced at Holmes, whose face, bent toward the map, betrayed neither curiosity nor disdain, but only that impassive concentration which I had learned to recognize as the herald of discovery. For many minutes he remained thus, his lean figure bent over the paper in absolute silence. I watched the quick darting of his eyes as they passed from one mark to another, pausing briefly, then resuming their restless journey. Now and again he shifted the map, holding it close to the lamp, then withdrawing it to arm's length, his brows drawn in the furrow of thought. Once he drew a magnifying lens from his pocket and examined a particular line with fastidious care, his lips compressed in a manner which suggested not satisfaction, but renewed perplexity. I, meanwhile, found my own gaze wandering over the document in vain, for it yielded to me nothing but confusion. The lines ran together without sense, and I marvelled that Holmes should find in them matter worthy of such scrutiny. Yet there was in his absorption a force which compelled my respect. It was as though the very silence of the room was filled with the movement of his thought, and I dared not intrude lest I break the spell. At length he laid down the glass and tapped lightly upon one corner with his long forefinger. "Observe, Watson," said he, "the hand which drew this portion. Here we find compass bearings set with admirable regularity, and see how the soundings are marked along this channel, each figure proportioned and consistent. No landsman, however diligent, could have achieved such accuracy without experience upon the sea. These are the traces of a practised navigator." He shifted his finger to another section. "Yet compare this coastline, irregular, uncertain, with depth figures crudely appended. The bearings are haphazard, as though copied without comprehension. Even the shading betrays hesitation. One hand, or two? That, my dear fellow, is the question. I incline to the belief that we have before us the work of more than one contributor, the one trained, the other careless." I bent to examine the contrast he indicated, and could not but acknowledge the truth of his remark. It was as though two voices spoke from the same page, one clear, the other discordant. When he had folded the map once more, Holmes leaned back in his chair, his keen eyes regarding me with that half-amused expression which so often accompanied his instruction. "You perceive, Watson, how difficult it is to pronounce upon the authenticity of such a document. Were it wholly crude, we might dismiss it as forgery without hesitation. Were it wholly expert, we might accept it as genuine. But this mixture, this duality of skill and clumsiness, renders it a riddle. I should not be surprised to learn that it is neither entirely false nor entirely true, but a curious amalgam of both. Therein lies the danger, for a partial truth is oft more deceptive than an outright lie." His words carried the weight of a moral as well as a deduction, and I reflected how often in life half-truths have wrought more havoc than bold falsehoods. The paper lay upon the desk once more, mute yet strangely eloquent, and I felt in its presence the stirrings of a mystery as deep as any sea it might once have charted. The thought carried me into a meditation of my own. How readily the human imagination leaps to visions of hidden treasure, of hoarded gold and long-buried jewels. A mere scrap of paper, stained and uncertain, is enough to awaken in the mind a host of glittering illusions. I pictured the late Captain Bracknell tracing these lines by lantern light, perhaps with the purpose of concealing some fortune gained in foreign climes. Yet even as the image rose before me, I recalled the solicitor's anxious tones, and Miss Bracknell's unprotected state. What devastation might not be wrought by the suspicion of wealth? Families sundered, reputations ruined, even blood spilt, all for the promise of riches which might never exist. The more I pondered, the more I felt that we stood not upon the threshold of discovery, but at the brink of peril. For greed, once awakened, is a fire which consumes alike the guilty and the innocent. Holmes, who had remained in thoughtful silence, now spoke with the sudden precision which marked the arrival of a conclusion. "Note this, Watson. A faint water stain upon the lower margin. It lies across the ink, not beneath it, and thus is of later date than the writing. And here, the longitude is misplaced by a degree, as though intentionally shifted. Such an error is no accident of an experienced seaman. Taken together, these trifles suggest that the map was tampered with, not for the purpose of discovery, but of concealment. It may be less a chart to guide than a veil to obscure." He placed the map back into its envelope and leaned against the firelight, his profile thrown into sharp relief. "There is more at stake here than buried gold, my dear fellow. We must be cautious, for the shadow of illusion is oft more dangerous than the substance of truth." His words hung in the air, solemn and prophetic, and I knew that the case, far from clarified, had grown more entangled than before. The carriage drew up before a sombre edifice in one of those quiet squares which lie to the west of London, its stone front darkened by the drizzle and its windows draped in heavy folds of mourning crape. Within, The atmosphere was thick with the hush that follows a household bereavement. Voices dropped to whispers, footsteps softened upon the carpets, and the very air seemed weighed down by restraint. The hall was dimly lit, and the figure of a solemn servant, black-clad and deferential, conducted us with subdued courtesy through passages where the shutters admitted but a grudging light. I could not help but note how the shadow of death lingers upon a house, making familiar corners oppressive, and how the grief of one life extinguished impresses itself upon all who tread within its orbit. Holmes, for his part, moved with his customary composure, his keen gaze missing no detail, from the faint scent of camphor in the air to the unused umbrella stand beside the door. He seemed already to weigh the character of the household before a word had been spoken, while I, more impressionable, felt chiefly the weight of sorrow that pressed upon every surface. Presently, there entered the room a young lady whose countenance at once arrested my attention. Miss Clara Bracknell possessed features of uncommon delicacy, her skin pale as ivory, and her bearing marked by a quiet composure that bespoke both discipline and fatigue. Yet for all her outward calm, her hands betrayed her inward struggle. They fluttered nervously with her handkerchief, and at moments her eyes shifted rapidly, as if to guard against some unspoken fear. Grief, yes. That much was plain in the faint hollow about her eyes. But it was grief, intermingled with something less simple, less transparent. She greeted us with a courtesy that was tinged with apprehension, and her resolve seemed at every instant to battle against some impulse toward collapse. To my physician's eye, she was a woman worn by more than mourning, one who carried a weight of anxiety as yet unconfessed. Holmes bowed with grave politeness, his gaze resting upon her with an attentiveness which, though respectful, missed nothing of her agitation. Holmes began the conversation in a tone unusually gentle, asking of her uncle's habits and his manner of life during his latter years. Miss Bracknell replied readily enough at first, describing him as a man of stern temperament, devoted to his naval recollections, and given to hours of solitude among his papers. Yet as Holmes pressed lightly upon certain particulars, whether her uncle had corresponded with former shipmates, whether he had spoken of discoveries abroad, or whether he had ever hinted at concealed property, I perceived in her replies a growing uneasiness. She hesitated, corrected herself, and once or twice coloured faintly, as though conscious of overstatement. At one mention of the map, she lowered her eyes and spoke with sudden brevity, as if eager to close the subject. To an unobservant listener, these might have seemed trifles, but in Holmes's presence, they assumed the significance of signposts. I, watching her closely, felt torn between sympathy for a bereaved young woman and suspicion that grief was not the only cause of her disquiet. Holmes, seated with fingers interlaced and head inclined, listened without interruption, his silence more searching than the most direct inquiry. Clara's words, which until then had been constrained by politeness, took on a tone of unease when Holmes, with his disarming courtesy, touched upon the subject of her wider family. She confessed, though reluctantly, that there existed certain distant cousins who had shown little regard for her uncle in his lifetime, but who might, with his passing, seek to advance some claim upon his modest estate. Her lips trembled as she spoke of them. Men of ambition, she said, who might not hesitate to employ unworthy means should they scent a hidden fortune. It was plain that the mere thought of these relations disturbed her, for her hands clasped and unclasped in restless agitation, and her eyes glanced toward the door as though fearful that some unwelcome presence might intrude upon our very conversation. There was, in her account, the suggestion not merely of quarrels, but of menace, of a danger less material than moral, which she hesitated to bring fully into words. Holmes, whose manner remained calm, pressed gently upon the subject of the map itself. At once I perceived in Miss Bracknell a curious transformation. Her voice, which had flowed, faltering yet steady, now became guarded, her sentences shorter, and her eyes, which had met Holmes's gaze directly, shifted aside at each inquiry. When he asked how the envelope had first come to her notice, she replied with a hesitation that betrayed more than the answer itself. When he inquired whether her uncle had ever mentioned such a paper, her denial was too swift, too resolute to convince. I, who sat a little aside, could not but feel the silent intensity of Holmes's observation, for his eyes never left her face, noting, as he afterwards remarked, each pause and diverted glance. It was not accusation that I read in his expression, but a cold registering of fact, as though he were tracing a line across a chart which only he could see. For myself, I felt a rising discomfort at the scene. I could not but reflect upon the cruelty of circumstance which placed a bereaved young woman under the pitiless scrutiny of Holmes's intellect. Was it not natural that grief should cloud the memory, that apprehension should falter upon the lips, that fear of scandal or family dispute should hold her tongue in check? A woman in her position, alone and pressed by the prospect of unfriendly claimants, might well appear evasive, where in truth she was only cautious. Yet in Holmes's presence even the most innocent reserve seemed damning, and I was forced to acknowledge that the very line which divides truth from concealment is thinnest where the heart is most troubled. It is an uneasy thing to watch the veil of private sorrow being lifted by so relentless a hand. It was in the course of this guarded conversation that a trifling remark slipped from her lips, unnoticed by herself, but caught by Holmes with the precision of a hawk upon its prey. Speaking of her uncle's habits, she mentioned that he had always kept one drawer of his escritoire firmly locked, and that even she, though admitted to much of his confidence, had never been permitted to see its contents. The words were scarcely uttered before she coloured and attempted to turn the discourse elsewhere, but Holmes, with a grave inclination of his head, allowed the matter to pass without comment. To me it seemed but the idle recollection of a niece recalling her guardian's peculiarities. To Holmes, I could see at once, it was the note of a deeper significance. The faintest smile touched his lips, and I knew that in this small and casual observation he had found a thread which might lead us far into the tangled skein that awaited our unravelling. The fog lay thick upon the river that morning, coiling in long grey ribbons along the narrow streets which led us down from the Strand toward the crowded wharves. The air was heavy with the mingled odours of tar, fish and smoke, and the cries of hawkers and carters came muffled as though wrapped in wool. It was not a quarter I frequented with comfort, and I confess that I felt some uneasiness as I followed Holmes's long stride through the damp alleyways. He, however, walked as one in his natural element, his eyes glancing swiftly to right and left, marking details invisible to the casual observer. The descent from the broad avenues of the city to this grim quarter seemed symbolic. From the light of order into the shadows where secrets festered. Here, Holmes assured me, we might best hope to encounter some trace of Captain Bracknell's former comrades. The bustle of the docks was as ceaseless as the tide itself. Rough figures moved in and out of warehouses. Barges swayed in the murk, and the foghorns moaned like distant beasts. My companion paused only once to observe a knot of sailors conversing in urgent tones, then pressed on with that quiet assurance which told me he had already chosen our destination. We soon found ourselves before a tavern whose low roof and weather-beaten sign bespoke years of hard patronage. Within, the air was thick with tobacco smoke and the smell of spilt rum. Men in salt-stained coats sat hunched over tankards, their faces roughened by wind and hardship. A hush fell as we entered, and I felt keenly the weight of suspicious glances cast upon us. We took our place at a corner table, and I observed that Holmes, while outwardly composed, missed nothing of our surroundings. He noted the scars upon the wooden tables, the quiet withdrawal of one man as our eyes met his, and the peculiar tension in the room that attends the presence of strangers. For myself, the atmosphere was oppressive. The smoke hung low, blurring the outlines of faces and giving the room the aspect of some subterranean cavern. The muttered talk of seamen rose and fell like the wash of waves, and I was conscious that at any moment the tide of their suspicion might turn upon us. Yet Holmes sat with his long fingers steepled, as though we were in our own sitting-room at Baker Street, awaiting the inevitable approach of one who could not resist curiosity. It was not long before such a figure emerged, a man of powerful build, with a scar running from temple to jaw, rose from a bench and approached with a swagger that carried less confidence than bravado. His clothes, though shabby, bore traces of better days at sea, and his eyes, sharp and restless, seemed to measure every movement of Holmes's hand. "Silas Drew," whispered Holmes in a tone scarcely audible to me, and then aloud invited the fellow to share our table. Drew accepted with a grunt, but I observed a flicker of unease in his face when Bracknell's name was spoken. He concealed it quickly beneath a coarse laugh, yet the twitch of his hand toward his tankard betrayed nerves not wholly subdued. He spoke in a rough accent, but his manner was not without a certain cunning. He watched Holmes as one accustomed to conceal as much as to reveal. There was in him that mixture of hardness and suspicion which comes of long service under harsh conditions, yet also the trace of a man who knew more than he intended to admit. Once settled, Drew began to recount fragments of the captain's life at sea. His words carried us to distant ports, Gibraltar, Bombay, and the West Indies, where Bracknell had sailed in command. He told of quarrels between officers, of disputes over cargo, of a mutiny once narrowly averted. Yet as I listened, I perceived a curious inconsistency. The details shifted, dates were confused. An incident attributed to one voyage was later transferred to another. It was as though Drew had half prepared a tale, but forgot the thread as he wove it. I watched Holmes closely, but he betrayed no sign of impatience. He listened with head slightly inclined, his long fingers playing idly with the rim of his glass. To me, the sailor's stories bore the stamp of invention rather than truth, yet they were delivered with such assurance that I could well imagine a less critical listener accepting them at face value. It was not the matter itself, but the manner of its telling, which betrayed the gaps in Drew's account. The conversation took a darker turn when Drew, leaning nearer across the table, lowered his voice and glanced about him with furtive care. His breath smelled strongly of spirits, but the words which fell from his lips were not those of drunken fancy. "Mark me, gentlemen," said he. "Men have killed for less than that map ye carry. Aye, killed, and will again, if the thing be not destroyed or hidden deep." His hand struck the table with a force that made the glasses tremble, and his scarred face twisted into a grimace of mingled fear and menace. I confess a chill ran through me at the intensity of his tone, for it seemed less a warning than a confession of knowledge too dangerous to be spoken aloud. He would say no more, but drained his tankard in one draught, as though to wash down words already too reckless. When at last we quitted that oppressive place, Holmes walked beside me in silence until we had turned into a quieter street. Then, with a dry smile, he remarked, "Our friend Drew is an indifferent liar, Watson, but a dangerous one nonetheless. His bluster conceals a knowledge which he dare not reveal, and which may yet prove fatal to him. Observe also that he was less anxious to warn us than to persuade himself that his silence would suffice. There is one further detail you may not have noticed. Throughout our conversation, a man in a dark pea-jacket loitered by the window, his eyes fixed upon us with unblinking attention. We are not the only ones interested in Captain Bracknell's map. Take care, for the game grows more perilous with each step we tread." The quiet certainty of his words impressed me more deeply than Drew's coarse menace, for I knew that Holmes spoke not from imagination, but from observation, and that his deductions seldom erred. It was close upon midnight when the stillness of Baker Street was disturbed by a loud rapping at our door. Holmes, who had been immersed in one of his chemical experiments, looked up sharply while I, dozing in my chair, started at the unexpected intrusion. Mrs. Hudson ushered in a messenger, a young clerk whose pallor betrayed the urgency of his errand. In his hand, he bore a hastily folded note, which he delivered into Holmes's keeping with a trembling bow. My friend broke the seal with his long forefinger, and as his eyes moved swiftly across the lines, his expression hardened into that mask of intentness which always presaged immediate action. "It is from Kent," said he. "His chambers have been broken into. The map is gone. He begs our presence at once." Without further word, He seized his coat and hat, and in another instant we were in the cab, the lamps of the city casting uncertain gleams through the mist as we rattled eastward. Holmes sat rigid, his chin upon his breast, silent save for a muttered phrase or two which escaped him unawares. For my own part, a sense of foreboding gripped me, as though the shadow which had hovered over this affair now fell more darkly than ever. Mr. Kent's office presented a scene of disarray such as might have followed the hasty search of some desperate intruder. Drawers hung open, their contents flung heedlessly upon the floor. Papers lay strewn across the carpet, and chairs had been overturned in the scuffle. Yet for all its apparent disorder, there was in the arrangement of the chaos a suggestion of artifice. Holmes's eye fell instantly upon a drawer which, though broken, bore the marks of a tool applied with precision rather than violence. "Observe, Watson," he murmured, "not the heedless work of a ruffian, but of one who knows precisely what he seeks." Mr. Kent, pale with agitation, wrung his hands as he pointed to the empty space upon his desk where the envelope had once lain. "Gone, Mr. Holmes," he cried. "The map is gone, and with it, I fear, my reputation for vigilance. What am I to tell the heirs?" Holmes's glance travelled slowly around the chamber, pausing at a scattering of ashes by the hearth and a chair set squarely against the wall, as though placed there after the intrusion. He made no immediate comment, but I, familiar with that intent gaze, knew that each trifle was already being marshalled in his mind towards some inexorable conclusion. The only witness to the outrage was the night watchman, a man advanced in years, who sat trembling upon a bench in the corridor. He told us, in halting tones, that while making his customary rounds, he had heard a faint sound within the office. Before he could raise the alarm, he was struck sharply from behind, and knew no more until he found himself lying stunned upon the floor. Of his assailant, he could offer little beyond a confused impression of a shadowy figure retreating into the darkness. "It was over in a moment, sir," he repeated. "A blow, and then blackness." Holmes regarded the man steadily, his brows drawn into a line of thought. "No outcry, no prolonged struggle," he said softly. The assailant was sure of his ground. Such confidence is not the mark of chance. He made a brief notation in his pocketbook, then turned once more into the office, leaving Kent and myself to wonder by what invisible threads he was already drawing the pattern of this midnight crime. The constables, bustling in and out with the officious zeal of men newly entrusted with responsibility, had already reached their conclusion. A sailor's cap, coarse in fabric and frayed at the edges, had been discovered beneath the overturned chair. It was displayed triumphantly by one sergeant, as though it alone sufficed to establish the culprit's identity. "Silas Drew, sir," he declared to Kent, with a note of satisfaction. "The very fellow's been seen lurking near the office these last days. A rough character, no doubt, and now we have his cap to prove him guilty." Kent, agitated beyond reason, seized upon this with relief, murmuring that it would explain all, while the constables nodded amongst themselves in self-congratulation. To me, however, the matter seemed strangely convenient. That the map should vanish in so decisive a manner, and that a known ruffian's property should be found obligingly upon the scene, bore too neat a harmony to be entirely credible. I turned to Holmes, expecting his agreement, but he said nothing, merely adjusting his gaze to the cap, with an expression of such studied indifference that I knew his mind was elsewhere. When at last the hubbub had subsided, Holmes began his own examination of the office. With the noiseless tread of a cat, he moved from desk to cabinet, his lens flashing in the lamplight as he scrutinized every surface. He stooped to the floor, noting the undisturbed layer of dust upon ledgers that had lain untouched, then ran his finger lightly along the cut of a lock which, though broken, showed none of the splintering or bruising that would accompany violence. "A clean stroke with a file," he murmured, "as neat as the surgeon's knife." He paused at the hearth, where ashes had been scattered across the grate, and sifted them carefully until he withdrew a fragment of sealing wax, faintly red against the grey. At the window, he inspected the catch, then shook his head. Not forced, he observed. Opened from within. All the while, the constables looked on with growing impatience, whispering amongst themselves that the matter was plain enough without this theatre. Yet Holmes ignored them utterly, his eyes missing no trifling detail, his mind already threading the pattern which the rest of us could not yet discern. I felt the same curious awe I had often experienced before, when some commonplace chamber, by the mere presence of my companion, became transformed into a stage upon which the invisible drama of crime revealed its silent actors. It was not until we had quitted the office and stood alone upon the dimly lit stair that Holmes broke his silence. He drew his coat about him, his voice low, yet edged with conviction. "You observed, Watson, how readily our guardians of the peace fixed upon Drew. The cap is their talisman, and they are content. But reflect. The locks cut with surgical neatness, the office ransacked with methodical care, and the ashes disposed as though to convey a message. These are not the hallmarks of a brawler who bludgeons watchmen in the dark. Drew, whatever his faults, is no craftsman of deception. The hand here is of subtler fibre, precise, deliberate, exacting." He paused, and his eyes, keen even in the shadow, seemed to pierce the fog of suspicion that had settled over us. "No, my dear fellow, this crime was too perfectly executed for such a clumsy agent. The map has passed into possession not of brute force, but of calculation. We must now ask ourselves, who profits by so careful a theft?" His words, quiet though they were, struck me with a weight heavier than any accusation, for I knew we stood upon the threshold of darker revelations. It was upon the following evening, as Holmes sat smoking in silent abstraction, and I busied myself with a medical journal, that a sudden pounding at the door brought Mrs. Hudson in with a face of alarm. Behind her stood a lad, breathless from haste, his cap clutched in one hand and a crumpled note in the other. He stammered my friend's name, and Holmes was upon him in an instant, relieving him of his errand. A single glance sufficed. Holmes passed the paper across to me without comment. It bore the seal of the police, hastily scrawled, and its message was short. Silas Drew found murdered in Whitechapel. Immediate assistance requested. Even as I read, Holmes had risen, thrusting his long arms into his coat. "The game quickens, Watson," said he, with a gleam in his eye. "We must away." The boy was dismissed with a coin, and within minutes we were in a hansom, rattling eastward through the mist-laden streets. I felt a chill seize me that had nothing to do with the night air, for Drew, however rough, had seemed more the braggart than the villain, and yet his life had been forfeit to this sinister business. The further we drove from the more familiar quarters of the city, the darker and narrower became the thoroughfares. The lamps, meagerly spaced, threw uncertain circles of light, revealing cobbles slick with damp and walls blackened with soot. The air hung heavy with the odours of refuse and spirits, while the cries of hawkers and the shuffle of unseen feet echoed through the alleys. Now and then a figure slipped past us, vanishing into the fog as though absorbed by it. I could not suppress a shudder as I beheld children crouching in doorways, their pinched faces pale beneath the gaslight. Crime and misery seemed to exude from every brick. Holmes, however, was unmoved by the squalor. His gaze, keen and unwavering, swept the shadows with the assurance of a man who finds clarity where others perceive only gloom. "It is here, Watson," he remarked softly, "that the masks are discarded and the truth of human nature stands most naked. Mark it well, for it is upon such soil that our present case has taken root." His words, though calmly spoken, struck me with the solemnity of prophecy. At last we reached a narrow court, where a small knot of constables stood gathered about a huddled form. The yellow glare of the lamps fell upon the figure of Silas Drew, slumped against the wall as though flung there by an unseen hand. His rough features, once animated by coarse humour and bluster, were now rigid in the stillness of death. His pockets had been turned out, their contents scattered upon the ground, a pipe, a clasp knife, a few coins. One hand lay open upon the stones, the fingers stiff and contorted, while a dark stain marked the collar of his shirt. I confess that the sight moved me deeply, for it was but a night ago that those same lips had uttered a warning both menacing and pitiable. Now the warning was sealed in silence. Holmes bent, swiftly, his eyes darting over the corpse with the precision of the surgeon. He touched the man's calloused palms, examined the line of his jaw, and frowned as his gaze rested upon the fingernails, curiously free of any recent stain. "Strange, Watson," he murmured, more to himself than to me. "Strange indeed. For a man who is said to have handled that map, these hands are singularly innocent." The words, quiet though they were, fell upon me with chilling force, for they hinted at a mystery darker than murder. It was at this moment, while I still gazed in pity upon the poor fellow's lifeless features, that Inspector Lestrade came bustling into the court with all the brisk assurance of his office. Small in stature but energetic in movement, he pushed his way through the knot of constables and saluted Holmes with a mixture of deference and familiarity. "Well, Mr. Holmes," said he, "another of your rough acquaintances has met his end, and no great loss to the community, I should say. Drew was a villain of the first water, and if you ask me, this is but the natural settling of scores amongst his kind. A drunken brawl, a knife in the dark, and an empty pocket. Nothing more mysterious than that." His words, delivered with the confidence of a man who believes the matter closed, caused Kent to nod gravely, while the constables murmured their agreement. Holmes, however, gave no sign either of assent or contradiction. His eyes had already returned to the body, and I recognized that peculiar stillness which with him denoted the utmost activity of mind. Lestrade, meanwhile, busied himself in giving instructions, secure in the belief that he had read the matter aright, but I could see that Holmes was far from convinced. Without a word, Holmes bent low over the body, his lens flashing in the dim light as he examined the coarse hands of the dead sailor. He touched the nails delicately, then raised his brows ever so slightly. They were clean, too clean for one accustomed to the grime of the docks. Next, he bent closer to the collar of the man's shirt, inhaling softly. "Spirits," he muttered, almost to himself, yet none upon the breath, spilt upon him, not consumed. From the breast pocket he withdrew a scrap of fabric, torn as though by design rather than accident, and cast it aside with a shake of the head. His fingers lingered upon the fingertips of Drew's right hand, turning them this way and that beneath the lamp. "Strange," he murmured again. "No ink, no stain of paper, not the least trace of handling such a document as our missing map. And yet—" He broke off, rising to his full height, his face betraying no more than the faintest shadow of thought. I, who had learned to read the gradations of his expression, knew that he had found matter here of the deepest significance, though he would not yet speak plainly. The contrast between Lestrade's blunt certainty and Holmes's quiet absorption could not have been greater. When at last we had stepped aside into the shelter of a narrow passage, Holmes turned to me with that air of restrained intensity which I had so often witnessed upon the eve of some revelation. "You observed, Watson," said he, "the pockets turned out, the scattered trinkets, the bruises upon the head, all the hallmarks of a common robbery, and yet it is too perfect, too arranged. Our thief was at pains to display robbery, but forgot that the hands of a man who has lately held an inked chart must betray their touch. Drew's hands are clean. He never touched the map, and therefore he never stole it." He paused, glancing back toward the gathering of police in the court. "What we have here is no drunken quarrel, but a calculated removal of an inconvenient witness. The true author of this deed wished to close Drew's lips forever, and to cloak his silence with the rags of a brawl. Mark my words, Watson, we have not yet touched the heart of this affair." His voice, quiet but resolute, struck me with a chill deeper than the night air, for I knew that where Holmes discerned design, murder rarely ended with a single victim. That night, Baker Street seemed unusually still, though the city beyond our windows rumbled on in its ceaseless, muffled way. Holmes sat at the table, his long figure slightly stooped, and before him lay a careful array of notes, his own neat memoranda of the map, the scene at Kent's chambers, and the grim discovery of Silas Drew. I had grown accustomed to these intervals of brooding quiet, yet there was in his manner on this occasion a peculiar gravity which weighed upon me. He leaned upon one hand, his brow furrowed, and the faint smoke from his pipe rose and hung motionless in the stagnant air. The lamp cast a pale circle upon the papers, and I, watching him from the armchair, felt as though we sat in some cloister of thought, cut off from the world's common bustle. Not once did he address me, nor show the least inclination for speech. Only the occasional movement of his pen across a scrap of paper betrayed the activity of that extraordinary brain. For my part, I longed to break the silence, yet sensed that to intrude upon his concentration would be to shatter some delicate process at work. So I waited, oppressed by the atmosphere, until at last he stirred. "Watson," he said without lifting his eyes, "do you recall the faint odour upon the envelope which Mr. Kent placed before us?" I nodded, though truth to tell I had scarcely noticed it. "It was sealing wax," Holmes continued, "but not of a sort one encounters in naval offices. The scent was fresh, too fresh to have lain these many months among the captain's papers. No. Someone opened that packet long after Bracknell had breathed his last, and resealed it with clumsy haste. The implication is clear. We are not dealing with a relic, but with an object tampered with for immediate purpose." He spoke in a tone of measured certainty, as one who builds a case from stones already firm. I was struck by the precision with which he weighed so intangible a detail. To me, the faint odour of wax would have passed without remark. To him, it bore the significance of a confession. "Consider," he added, finally looking up, "how such trifles betray more than all the bold assertions of witnesses. The dead cannot tamper with their own papers, Watson. The living have been busy here." His eyes, sharp as steel, gleamed in the lamplight, and I felt a shiver of anticipation. He next took up the fragment of his notes which related to the appearance of the map itself. "Observe this margin," said he, pushing the paper toward me. "Do you recall the edges of the document? Those faint undulations, the discoloration in patches?" I nodded again. "They are the marks of water, not of damp from a desk, but of soaking, such as one might incur at sea or in deliberate contrivance. Now here lies the crux. These stains are beneath the later folds and abrasions, showing them to be older than the supposed burglary at Kent's office. In plain words, Watson, the story that the map was stolen but a few nights ago will not hold. It had been exposed, handled, and altered long before the intrusion was staged. The burglary, then, was but a mask." He leaned back, and his gaze grew distant. "We must ask ourselves not merely who desired the map, but who sought to deceive us as to the time and manner of its disappearance. That is the line upon which truth will be found." His words fell with the quiet inevitability of fate, and I confess my heart beat faster, for I felt that the case, far from nearing its resolution, had deepened into a labyrinth of darker design. The following morning brought with it a note from Miss Bracknell, delivered by hand and addressed jointly to Holmes and myself. Its contents were brief and formal, expressing regret that circumstances compelled her to decline any further interview. She offered no explanation beyond a vague reference to fatigue, and concluded with a polite but unmistakable request that we desist from troubling her further. The very brevity of the letter struck me as unconvincing. It lacked the warmth of her earlier manner and seemed more the product of constraint than of inclination. Holmes read it through twice, his brows scarcely shifting, before laying it aside without comment. To me, however, the refusal carried a weight of significance. Why should she, who had received us with courtesy, now shrink from our presence with such abruptness? The thought pressed upon me that her withdrawal marked less a wish for privacy than an effort to evade discovery. Yet Holmes, leaning back in his chair with his pipe, betrayed neither surprise nor disquiet, as though he had already reckoned upon the change. As the day wore on, I found myself brooding upon Clara Bracknell's conduct. The image of her pale, trembling hands, her hesitant replies, and the nervous glances she cast when questioned about the map returned to me with fresh insistence. Could it be that beneath her grief lay knowledge she dared not reveal? Each trifling evasion, each faltering answer seemed, in recollection, to acquire a darker shade. I confess I was torn between suspicion and pity. She was, after all, a solitary young woman beset by greedy relatives and the shadow of scandal. Was it not natural that she should cling to silence, even if innocence were her only shield? Yet the thought recurred with increasing force that she knew more than she had admitted, perhaps much more. In spite of myself, I could not drive away the conviction that Miss Bracknell was no passive figure in this strange affair, but a participant whose secret, whether innocent or guilty, lay at the heart of it. That evening, unable to restrain my uneasiness, I ventured to express these suspicions to Holmes. He listened with patient attention, his head inclined, and when I had finished, he gave a slight shake of the head. "My dear Watson," said he quietly, "you allow your impressions to outrun your reason. Fear, grief, and guilt may wear the same mask to an untrained eye, and it is precisely such confusions upon which truth is often lost. Do not mistake evasion for complicity. Sometimes it is but the reflex of one who dreads entanglement in a net of circumstance." He rose, and taking the note once more between his fingers, held it thoughtfully to the lamplight. "No, Watson, Miss Bracknell may harbour secrets, but it is not yet clear that they are of her own making. The hand which guides this affair lies elsewhere, more deliberate and more dangerous. Let us not be led astray by appearances, however suspicious they may seem." His words, though calmly uttered, left me with the uneasy sense that what had appeared to me as a clear suspicion was but a mirage, and that the real enemy moved yet unseen in deeper shadow. The morning was clear when we quitted London, yet for all the brightness of the spring air, I felt a heaviness settle upon me as our train bore us southward. The city, with its noise and crowding, soon gave way to open country. Hedgerows faintly green, fields dotted with sheep, and here and there a spire rising above the trees. To an untroubled mind it might have seemed a peaceful journey, but to me the very calm of the landscape jarred against the grim business which occupied our thoughts. Holmes, seated opposite, was absorbed in his own reflections, his eyes half closed, and his fingers drumming lightly upon the arm of the seat. He spoke scarcely a word, and I, left to my own ruminations, found the contrast between the placid countryside and the violence of recent days almost oppressive. Every mile we travelled seemed to carry us further from the familiar world of Baker Street and deeper into a region of secrecy, where the quiet lanes and silent meadows might conceal designs as dark as any in the alleys of London. When at last the train slowed into a small country station, Holmes roused himself with a sudden sharpness, as though the change of scene had brought him back into action. A short drive brought us to Bracknell Hall, the late captain's estate. The house stood upon a slight rise, its stone facade weathered and grey, the windows shuttered against the day. There was no stir of servants about the place, save for a single gardener who touched his cap and vanished wordlessly into the shrubbery. The air of neglect hung heavily. Weeds thrust between the gravel of the drive. Ivy clambered unchecked along the walls, and the great oak door creaked upon its hinges, as though protesting disuse. Within, the rooms we passed were dim and silent, their furniture draped in white as if the house itself were in mourning. Even the echo of our footsteps upon the floor seemed subdued, muffled by an atmosphere of secrecy. Holmes's eyes swept over each detail with quick precision, though his face betrayed no comment. To me, the absence of life within those walls was more eloquent than any presence could have been. It was a house that had retreated into itself, guarding whatever truth lay hidden in its depths. Holmes, with his usual directness, requested that we be shown below stairs. A reluctant maid, pale and taciturn, led us through narrow passages to the stone steps descending into the cellar. The air grew cooler, the smell of damp and mildew stronger, and our lantern cast long, wavering shadows upon the walls. Holmes moved slowly, his eyes alert to every cobweb and trace of dust, tapping here upon a panel, there upon the flagstones, listening for the telltale echo of hollowness. He stooped to examine a corner where the mortar crumbled, then paced the length of the wall with measured tread, pausing to note faint scratches near the base. His lantern swept in arcs of light, illuminating racks long empty, a broken barrel, and patches of moisture that gleamed upon the stone. There was in his movements a methodical patience, as though he traced a map invisible to any but himself. I, meanwhile, felt the oppressive weight of the house above us, and the silence broken only by the drip of water from some unseen crevice. Suddenly, Holmes's stick struck sharply against one section of the wall, and he inclined his head with a gleam in his eye. "There, Watson," said he softly, "the stone does not answer true." And with those words, I knew he had come upon the secret which Bracknell Hall had so long concealed. Holmes, after pacing the cellar with a hunter's patience, halted suddenly before a length of wall darker than the rest. He raised his stick, tapped twice, then, with a decisive blow, struck against the mortar. To my astonishment, a portion of the stone yielded, shifting inwards with a hollow scrape. "A common device, Watson," he remarked quietly, "but effective when forgotten." With deliberate care, he pulled free a narrow panel, revealing behind it a cavity scarcely large enough to hold a small chest. Within, resting upon the dust as though untouched for years, lay a wooden box, its lid bound with a rusted clasp. Holmes lifted it forth and placed it upon an upturned barrel. His fingers, deft and sure, undid the clasp, and he looked up at me with that rare flicker of anticipation in his eyes. "Now we shall see, Watson, whether Captain Bracknell left truth or illusion to his heirs." The lid creaked open, and in that moment my pulse quickened, for it seemed as though we stood upon the brink of revelation. The box, however, contained no glittering hoard. Instead, neatly stacked within, were packets of correspondence, their seals intact and bearing the firm hand of Captain Bracknell. Holmes drew out several, turning them beneath the lantern light. "Naval orders, receipts, private letters," he murmured. There were ledgers too, written in the captain's precise script, which dealt not with treasure, but with debts, quarrels, and matters of discipline. One document in particular caught Holmes's attention, a memorandum denouncing the conduct of certain officers, men whose names he underlined with evident interest. Another letter, heavily folded, spoke of a voyage abandoned under dubious circumstances. It was plain, even to my untrained eye, that these papers bore witness not to wealth concealed, but to disputes and disgraces long buried. The promise of fortune was nowhere to be found. Instead, here was the residue of a man's troubled dealings, preserved as though to outlast his life. I felt a pang of disappointment mingled with unease, for the discovery hinted at motives less simple and more perilous than gold. Holmes replaced the papers with measured care, then turned to me, his expression one of quiet triumph. "You see, Watson, the riddle of the map begins to resolve itself. Its lines and symbols were no innocent charting of coasts, but the deliberate craft of deception. Observe how the correspondence and ledgers speak of quarrels that might tarnish reputations were they revealed. What better means to shield such truths than to weave about them the glamour of treasure? The human imagination is ever greedy for gold, and thus no eye would search for the sting of dishonor when dazzled by the lure of wealth. The map was designed not to guide, but to mislead, to distract all thought from these letters, which hold the true secret of Captain Bracknell's life." He paused, his gaze steady upon me. "The promise of fortune was but a curtain, Watson. Behind it lies a stage set for envy, for resentment, and perhaps for crime. We are no longer chasing shadows of buried coin, but the darker inheritance of human folly." His words rang through the dim cellar with the finality of judgment, and I felt the mystery deepen into graver channels than even I had foreseen. The drawing room of Bracknell Hall was sombre in the waning light, its tall windows shuttered, its air heavy with disuse. Yet into that chamber Holmes had summoned the principal actors in this grim affair: Miss Clara Bracknell, pale but composed; Mr. Kent, visibly strained by his professional anxieties; Inspector Lestrade, brisk and impatient as ever; and lastly, the gentleman who had hitherto styled himself Clara's closest adviser, seated with a look of outward calm that seemed ill-matched to the solemnity of the occasion. Holmes, standing near the empty hearth, had about him that grave air which I had come to associate with the moment before his revelations. He inclined his head slightly as we entered, then waited until silence had settled upon the company. "I have asked you here," said he, in tones measured and low, "that the shadows surrounding Captain Bracknell's legacy may at last be dispelled. The truth, though less romantic than certain have imagined, has been sufficient to breed theft, deceit, and murder. It is time that veil was lifted." A chill seemed to pass through the room as each face turned toward him, and I, watching Miss Bracknell's tremor of the hands, felt that the hour of reckoning was upon us. Holmes began with that methodical clarity which so often carried conviction even before his proofs were complete. "We were presented," said he, "with a map whose lines betrayed a divided authorship. Portions executed with genuine nautical skill, others clumsily appended. That alone suggested artifice. When first I handled the envelope, I detected the fresh odour of sealing wax, proof that it had been tampered with after the captain's death. Later, at Mr. Kent's office, the so-called burglary displayed too neat a hand. The cut of the lock was precise, the disarray arranged rather than natural, and the unfortunate Drew was burdened with guilt for a crime beyond his capacities. Finally, upon his murder, his clean hands testified that he had never touched the map at all. Each of these threads, trifling in itself, converges toward one inevitable conclusion. The map was not a relic of Bracknell's voyages, but a fabrication introduced to conceal another truth. It was a lure, designed to occupy the imagination with visions of gold, while the reality, letters of debt, quarrels, and dishonor, remained hidden from view. His eyes swept the circle before him. Even Lestrade, usually restless under such addresses, leaned forward in rapt attention. A silence followed, heavy with expectation, broken only by Clara's faint sigh. Holmes allowed it to deepen before turning, slowly and deliberately, toward the man seated nearest to her. "It was you, sir," he said evenly, "who encouraged Miss Bracknell's belief in the map while secretly directing her affairs. Your friendship, cloaked in solicitude, was but the mask for envy and desperation. You forged the additions upon the map, resealed the envelope, and contrived the theft at Kent's office, knowing suspicion would fall upon Drew. When he grew restive, you silenced him forever. In truth, your object was never treasure but control. Control over Miss Bracknell's inheritance, and over the narrative that might have destroyed your standing had the captain's letters been revealed." The accused man stiffened, his lips parting as if to deny, yet no word emerged. Holmes's voice, calm as ever, carried the weight of certainty. "The mask of loyalty cannot survive the evidence. You sought to wield her trust as a weapon, and in doing so, betrayed not only her, but yourself." Clara, stricken, turned her eyes away, and Kent gave a groan of horror. In that instant, the edifice of pretense collapsed, leaving only the stark figure of treachery exposed before us. The accused man's composure, already strained beneath Holmes's relentless reasoning, now crumbled altogether. He rose half from his chair, then sank back, his hands trembling upon the armrests. "Yes," he cried hoarsely, "it was I. I forged the cursed map, I sealed the papers, I struck down Drew when his tongue grew dangerous. Do you think I could endure to see her," he pointed a shaking finger toward Clara, "bestow her fortune upon wastrels while I, who had given her counsel starved in debt. The world turned against me. Every card of chance fell ill, and I, once respected, was left with nothing but envy in my heart. I swore that if wealth were whispered of in Bracknell's name, I would be master of it. She trusted me, and I used that trust as my weapon. His voice sank into a bitter whisper. It was not gold I sought, but command, for envy is a fiercer hunger than coin. He covered his face with his hands, and the room was filled with the dreadful spectacle of a man stripped bare by his own confession, his ruin laid as starkly before us as the forged lines of the map itself. Miss Bracknell uttered a faint cry, and I turned to see her rise unsteadily, her face blanched as though life had been drained from it. Her eyes, wide with horror, fixed upon the man who had styled himself her friend, her protector. In that gaze there was no anger, only the shattering grief of one betrayed where trust had been deepest. Her hands trembled as they clutched the back of a chair, and her lips parted without sound, as if words could not frame the enormity of what she felt. To me, it was a sight more poignant than the criminal's confession, the wreck of innocence, the destruction of confidence in human fidelity. She turned aside, hiding her face, and I, moved beyond measure, could scarce restrain a word of comfort, though I knew that none would avail. In that silent figure, I saw the true cost of the crime, greater than theft or even blood, the ruin of a heart's belief in loyalty. Lestrade, who until then had stood silent, stepped forward with professional briskness. "You have heard his confession," said he. "The law will take its course." He laid a firm hand upon the culprit's shoulder, and though the man half rose in defiance, the gesture faltered and sank into sullen silence. His face hardened into the mask of one who knows resistance to be vain, yet cannot forbear the bitterness of it. Holmes, watching with calm gravity, added in his quiet tone, "The law will claim you, but it is envy that has undone you. Men speak of gold as the root of evil, yet it is oft the shadow of wealth more than its substance that corrupts. Remember that as you go to meet your fate." With that, Lestrade led the prisoner away, his heavy step echoing down the passage, leaving behind a silence deeper than any words could compass. Holmes turned at last to Clara, his manner gentle but reserved, as though he knew that even his wisdom could not mend the wound which treachery had left upon her spirit. The fog lay thick over the city as our cab rattled westward, the wheels clattering against the uneven stones with a rhythm that seemed to echo the sombre reflections within us. Holmes sat opposite me, his long frame sunk into the corner, his chin resting upon his chest, the sharp angles of his face thrown into relief by the dim lamplight filtering through the misted glass. He spoke not a word, nor did I, for the memory of Clara's stricken countenance and the criminal's bitter confession weighed heavily upon my heart. The horse's hooves beat steadily onward, yet it seemed to me that we moved through a dream, the ordinary sounds of London softened into unreality by the fog. When at last we alighted at Baker Street, Holmes paid the driver without lifting his gaze, and together we ascended the familiar steps in silence, as though reluctant to break the spell of sombre meditation that held us both in its grip. Once in our sitting room, Holmes cast aside his coat, reached for his pipe, and settled into the armchair with a long breath that seemed to release the tension of the preceding days. The first curls of smoke rose into the air, winding upward in delicate spirals. "You see, Watson," he began slowly, "the promise of fortune is more dangerous to mankind than fortune itself. The human heart, once inflamed by the suggestion of hidden wealth, ceases to reason. It feeds upon its own illusions, building castles upon sand. In this case, a scrap of paper, drawn with deliberate falsehood, was sufficient to unsettle the minds of men, to breed contention among heirs, and to lead one weak spirit to envy, fraud, and murder. The world is full of such phantoms, and men, ever credulous, pursue them with more fervour than they would any solid coin." His voice, low and even, held no triumph, only the weary wisdom of one who has seen too often the darker turnings of human folly. He drew upon his pipe, then leaned forward, his eyes bright with that piercing light I knew so well. Consider, my dear fellow, how swiftly a rumour takes hold, and how greed clings to it. The treasure that lies before one may be ignored, yet let but a whisper suggest untold riches hidden from view, and the imagination seizes upon it with inexhaustible vigour. A fortune in the pocket breeds caution, but a fortune in the mind breeds madness. It is the mirage, not the gold, that lures men to ruin. Our culprit sought no true wealth. He was consumed by the image of what might be, and so he forged, deceived, and slew, chasing a phantom that fled at his touch. That, Watson, is the more potent alchemy, not metal, but dream. He tapped the ashes gently from his pipe, his face grave yet contemplative, as though he spoke less to me than to some silent tribunal of reason and truth. I found myself reflecting upon the events with a sorrow deeper than anger. The unfortunate Clara, deprived not only of her inheritance's security, but also of trust in one who had stood closest to her, seemed to me the greater victim. Her grief, quiet and restrained, was more terrible to witness than the criminal's collapse, for it spoke of a heart broken not by violence, but by betrayal. On the other side stood the man himself, undone not by poverty alone, but by envy that gnawed at him like a hidden worm. He might have borne his debts, might even have rebuilt his fortunes, had he not sought to grasp what was not his. Thus the illusion of wealth proved more destructive than the reality of want. Between her despair and his disgrace lay the lesson that false hope, once embraced, can consume both the innocent and the guilty alike. The fire burned low, and Holmes at last removed the pipe from his lips, fixing his gaze upon the glowing embers. "Illusions, Watson," said he quietly, "are bonds more secure than any chain. A man who believes in them will guard them, nurture them, and, as we have seen, destroy himself to preserve them. The law will punish the act, but the true sentence lies in the folly that preceded it." He rose, stirred the fire with the poker, and stood for a moment in its glow, his profile stern and thoughtful. I, moved by the weight of his words, could add nothing. And so, the night closed upon us. Holmes lost in his reflections, I in my own sombre thoughts. Both of us chastened once more by the inexhaustible lesson that it is not fortune, but the phantom of fortune, which so often proves man's undoing. Holmes sat back in his chair, the dying embers of the fire reflecting faintly in his eyes. "You see, Watson," said he, "it was never gold that lured men to ruin, but the dream of it. A fortune imagined has toppled empires, destroyed friendships, and, as here, driven a man to betrayal and blood. Reality rarely exerts such tyranny as the illusions we forge ourselves." I was silent, pondering his words, until at last he added with a faint smile, "It is a curious study, is it not, how men guard their illusions more fiercely than their possessions? And so, I put it to you. What do you think was the criminal's greatest error? His envy, his deception, or his belief that an illusion could ever be mastered? Share your thoughts below, and if you enjoyed unraveling this mystery, be sure to comment, subscribe, and pass the story on to friends who cherish the art of deduction. More adventures await, and every shadow may yet conceal a clue.